Today we are joined by Lora-Marie Bernard, who is a local author, and she'll be talking and taking questions about her latest work, The Yellow Rose of Texas. And we are joined today by my colleagues, Vernitra and Jeanette, as well as Lori. So I'm going to turn it over to Lora-Marie, and thank you for joining us today.
Okay, so everyone can hear me, right? I'm still unmuted. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me today, Jory. We are talking about, I think this is the second time that I've done this for the library. We're talking about the book, The Yellow Rose of Texas, and we basically take a journey of the way that the legend about the Yellow Rose of Texas came to be. So my book starts with the song and traces back probably the farthest that any research that I could really find, tracing it all the way back to its very origins. And then we go through that, and then the book talks about Emily D. West, who was going to become the Yellow Rose of Texas, but she was actually a free Black woman from New York who came down to Texas to work for James Morgan at the New Washington Association, probably December before the Texas Revolution. And she eventually loses her free papers, and she has to find a passport to get back to New York, and that's basically where the trail of her kind of ends. And my trail ends there too. I did not find out what happens to her, if she ever gets her passport or if she actually goes back to New York, but I like to hope that she did. And then the book discusses how those two met in the latter part of the 1900s. And having been a journalist and a writer for most of my career, it was very interesting to find out that journalists and writers had an awful lot to do with creating that, what I call a myth, and connecting a woman to a salacious tale when she probably didn't deserve it. And for anyone who doesn't know about the Yellow Rose of Texas, those of us who grew up in Texas, we tend to know it, especially if you are of a certain generation. You heard about the legend. A lot of times because the two people who were involved in creating it were still alive. But if you haven't, or if you're new to Texas, the legend is basically that a woman named Emily Morgan, and if you notice, I called her Emily D. West, but in the legend, she assumes the last name of her boss so that she is portrayed as a slave. And this particular woman is supposed to have been in the tent with Santa Anna right before the Texas Revolution, and she was supposed to be seducing him and having sex with him so that Sam Houston could create his surprise attack at the Battle of San Jacinto. That's the tale. And that's where my book starts talking about how that tale, which we believe came from Sam Houston, gets connected to a legend in the 1900s, literally probably over 100 years after she died. So that's kind of a background, a little bit of context there. So yeah, a lot of people have a lot of different questions depending upon what part of that story they're interested in. I'm usually surprised at those because I did not set out to write a war book, but depending upon how much of a war buff you are, I actually get lines of questions about the actual battle because people like the way that I did the battle, and I never set out to be a war writer in any way. The story, for those of you who don't know the context to it, actually came to my idea when Jory and I were talking about another book that I wrote. Without going into that rabbit hole, we'll just say that it's a book about a Texan who was raised by James Morgan. And after I did that presentation for her, Jory started asking me about Morgan and did I ever do any research on that? And I said, actually, I did, but I had to stop because I was getting so angry at what I was learning. So later, other people also told me that they thought a book about the Yellow Rose of Texas, even just explaining to people that the song is not even written in Texas. It was written in New York. It wasn't written by a black man. It was written by a white man wearing blackface as part of a minstrel act. And that is a huge discovery. And that now we even know maybe which minstrel actually wrote it and why. So anyway, people started talking to me about just uncovering the truth about the story, about the song. And that's when I started doing research into Emily and trying to give her what I would call a dignified context to her life. Because most people believe at this point that Sam Houston was just making up a story. Why he was making up a story about her, we can talk about that in social terms. We can talk about that in an intimate relationship term. Maybe he had a crush on her and she rebuffed him, whatever. But as women, we tend to know why guys make up stories about us. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. So the book is actually dedicated to Jory and to another historian that I know down in Brazoria County, Jennifer Parsley, and it is also dedicated to Emily D. West herself and for all that she did to illuminate my understanding of American history, illuminate the experience of a woman single in a revolution, and the empowering story of the free Blacks that we have forgotten in our American history.
Definitely. And so I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions for Lora-Marie. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first. Well,
Yay!
Yes, so exciting. So I have the book, but I have not read it yet. But I'm very excited. Very excited, and I was very touched when I saw that Jory, that the book was dedicated to Jory when I opened it up. So that's very sweet.
Yeah.
So so I grew up in Texas. You know, I grew up going to Houston schools, Houston area schools. And what I would love to do is to look at some old textbooks, or I don't know, maybe current textbooks as well, but definitely some old textbooks from the 90s, because that's, you know, when I would have come across this story. And
Yeah.
I'm curious now, how was it presented back then? Because I do remember growing up knowing that, you know, there was this story of this biracial or this, you know, light-skinned Black woman who was in this tent and there was something going on. So I definitely remember being a young, you know, middle school history student and knowing that. So I would just love to see, how was that actually articulated?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure George would say the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I think you grew up in the same area that I did. You know, you hear this story. To dissect what you just said, which was that it was a story about a biracial woman, right? Where that came from was not Sam Houston and his supposed tale to a English traveler. It was the song itself. The song itself it's sung from the perspective of a Black man, which is why many people thought that a Black person wrote it. In the song itself, it talks about the mulatto woman, right? Which has had different meanings at different points in our history. But in its original context in the 1830s, it would have probably meant a Creole woman from Louisiana. And that she's gone to the Rio Grande. Well, the real story about Emily D. Morgan, or Emily D. West, yeah, I'm going to talk about her as Emily D. West, not the legend, Emily D. Morgan. I have to keep thinking about that every time I'm talking because I switch it depending upon what frame of reference I'm coming from. But as Emily D. West, she was never at the Rio Grande. But the song talks about her being lost along the Rio Grande, and here is a Black man trying to go find her. So the legend mixes pieces of the song with the experience of Emily D. West, who actually was at the Battle of San Jacinto, who actually did come down to work at Morgan's New Washington Association. So when the two became connected in the 60s, and that happened because of a communications director at Texas A&M who got hold of the story that Sam Houston told an English traveler. When he told this English traveler the story, the English traveler did not include it in anything at all. He just wrote it down, he put it in an envelope, and he put it away. Okay, 100 years later, when we're in the middle of the 1950s-ish, and we're entering the Cold War, and there's this big movement in the United States to create a, what we call, I think in the industry, myth-making, the myth-making of America as being a superpower, as being super wonderful. States were doing the same thing. And so they got into the archives of the English traveler, whose name is William Bollard. They found this story that Sam Houston tells of Emily D. West. The story is very sexual in nature. It is very salacious, and it is basically one man's account. An account that actually differs from the account that he gave Congress about how the battle went down. There's no mention of her in that official account. So the archivists who are putting together this book about William Bollard, because William Bollard wrote a lot about Texas, and he very much loved Texas. So he very much fits into this narrative that's going on in our country at that time, where we're looking for stories to make us feel really good about being an American, and hence also being very proud to be a Texan, right? So the people that actually put the book together, which is now called Williams Bollard, oh, and I don't have it right here, Williams Bollard's Texas. It becomes a very, very popular book. It becomes so popular. It's like 50 Shades of Grey, or Fortnite, or Kim Kardashian, or Keeping Up with the Kardashians. It becomes a huge, huge hit. People love it, and people all over the world read it. And that kind of starts what what you and I grew up under, the Dallas and the big Texas stuff, right? That when we all were like, yay, Texas. That kind of starts all of that. Well, as that book's going on, this salacious tale that Sam Houston did, it gets out. It does not get out through the book, because the people that put the book together are very much appreciative of what they can and can't make as credible, so they're very credible people. They're archivists at the Newberry Archives in Chicago. And so they are not interested in putting this little story in there, because they don't think it's very credible. But it does get out, and the communication director at the time at Texas A&M, he finds it, he reads it, he thinks it's a fantastic tale. He believes that, oh my gosh, here is this woman, she did all this stuff for the Texas Revolution, and we don't even do anything to recognize her. We've got to do something. Well, he goes to a very prominent Texas reporter called, his name is Frank Tolbart. And when I was going through school, you bowed to the name of Frank Tolbart. He worked at the Dallas Morning News. He wrote a lot about Texas history. He wrote a lot about Texas pride. They get together, and Frank decides to start writing about her. And that's how it actually ends up into Texas mainstream. It happened through the newspapers. So this is not something that happened through the educational system. This happened through the newspapers. And you could say that was fake news in today's world. We probably would call it fake news. But it keeps going because Frank Tolbart is very revered. I mean, he is a big figure. And the more he writes about it, the more it picks up steam, the more Texas A&M gets involved in it, the more the song gets played, because the song has its own journey in American music history. It was so popular in the 50s and the 60s that Elvis was singing it, and Bing Crosby was singing it. And there was a Mitch Miller, a big musician during the time. He was playing it with a big band orchestra. I mean, this song was all over the United States. So when the two combined, you can kind of, that's why I kind of call it like a Keeping Up with Kardashian kind of thing. It was like the two things just exploded. And so by the time you and I start hearing about it, we don't hear about it as really Texas history. We hear about it as a Texas cultural story, as a Texas cultural moment, or a marker of Texas culture. And so it does kind of seep into the schools a little bit, but I don't really remember it being right up there with Stephen F. Austin, but it was always something that was in the back, right? And I do remember my father telling it to me first when we were driving down the road, and the song came on and he told me the story. And I thought at that moment, I thought, well, that's weird. I mean, I kind of felt that as a woman, like, that's a weird thing, because I knew Texas history, right? And I knew that when Texas became when it got its independence, it was a slave state. So why would a slave want to do this? It just didn't fit with me. And I think with a lot of women in general, we always kind of had an idea that maybe this wasn't quite what they make it out to be. But there is a following of Texas fans, that's the best way to put it, who really, really believe this story to be true. And I've even been at some book signings where people bring up a book by James Michener. It's called James Michener's Texas. And I don't know if you remember that when that was on TV. But it was on,
about this thick.
Yeah, the book about that thick, but the show was, I guess it was like a series or something. I vaguely remember it as a kid, but they come up with that book and they say, but it's in this book. And I have to explain to them, that book is fiction. That book's not real. That book is fiction. And he tells a whole different story about her. He turns her into even less than Sam Houston made her. He turns her into a common slave whore who crawls into the tent and just wants to have sex with the general so she can put it on her notch. So he even degrades her more. So this is what we were growing up under. And I don't even know, you were probably like me, you just kind of like heard it, you thought about it. I loved the Yellow Rose. The Yellow Rose meant so much to me. I mean, I loved Yellow Roses. I loved the idea of it being about Texas culture and all of this. But I don't know that I connected it to the story, but the story itself really bothered me. And the more I grew up and the more that I learned, the more that I really felt like it deserved, this woman deserved a better memory in our history than she got. So, so I just felt like I needed to find some real context for her. And I think I did. A lot of people will tell me that, well, this is a book where you're going to have to back up every word. And I'm like, I knew that when I sent it in, and I'm ready to back up every word. She was an educated, free Black woman working with major abolitionists in New York for equality between the whites and the Blacks. There were huge, huge riots at the time, right before the Texas Revolution. And for some reason, a major abolitionist witnessed her contract with Morgan, and she came down to Texas as a woman, just like you and I would be. We signed a contract with the boss. He pays us a certain amount of money, and we do a job for him. And then we're done with our contract. That is what she signed. She was not a slave. She was not an indentured servant. She was a woman who came down as a businesswoman to work at the port. And then she got on the Battle of San Jacinto, when that happened, she was taken prisoner with all the other prisoners, and she lost her free papers on the battlefield. And, as women, we can think about, why would a woman lose her free papers that she always kept on her, because she needed them to prove she wasn't a slave? How could she lose free papers on a battlefield? Well, you can imagine. So, yeah. So that's, I don't know if that really answers the way it was presented in the 80s and the 90s, but the fast answer, I guess, is as an exploitive tale.
Yeah. I remember when I was a kid asking my parents, because I had, listened to enough of the lyrics, and I was like, why would they call her yellow? And it was explained to me why she was referred to that way. And I kind of was like, oh, okay. And then later on, I remember, more of the realization dawning on me, what was going on in that song, and how it's like so many other songs in our culture. I mean, it has a nice beat to it, or it's catchy.
Yeah.
It's a catchy tune, and we're singing all kinds of stuff. I know that Vernitra and I have talked about Billie Holiday and some of the songs that she sang, and a lot of people were really into the songs. But when you think about it, like, one song talks about the bitter fruit from the tree, and when you think about it, I mean, it's a wonderful song, and it's meaningful. It's very meaningful, but it's not something like, oh, gee, this is, a song that's going to make me really happy.
Well, the Yellow Rose was actually part of a minstrel skit.
Right.
And, well, you've seen the presentation. But it was part of a minstrel skit. And so there was the Rosebud, and I mean, a lot of different states had were represented as flowers in this skit, or flowers from that state were represented in that skit. And so they didn't really think of it as some really important song that can't be messed with. It was not like this great, it was a popular song. It was the most popular of all of the songs in the minstrel skit because of its tune. And people will say that. Music historians will say it's the tune that keeps going. So they had it in the first skit. They did it. Then later on, they changed it. And they added some banjo. They added guitar. They added a musical score, because originally it didn't even have a musical score. And so they were selling the musical score around town for 25 cents, and it just flew off the wall. I mean, people just went out and bought that thing, and it made the publisher a lot of money when he released it. Then it kind of goes away. It does come back as a Confederate tune, and it actually remains a very popular marching tune in Eastern Europe, I've heard. I have not done research on that, but I've heard that in Eastern Europe, it has a new life again. So, but it does become a Confederate tune. Then it kind of goes away when I say it goes away for a little bit, I'm saying it goes away for a couple decades, like maybe 20 decades or something. Then it comes back, and at the early part of the 1900s, you would have some popular white singers, actually sing the original lyrics, which are so racist today that there's a disclaimer on them. So you had white men kind of maintaining that minstrel attitude, where they're white people singing about this blacks, singing this song with its original lyrics as though they were black men. But I guess now that I say that, that's kind of weird to me. But anyway, that happened. Then it starts to change. And this also adds to the whole question about where does the legend fit in today, and how do we look at that with a modern lens? Because as the song began to change, it would lose its reference to a biracial woman, it
Mhm.
loses its reference to the love portion of the song. It starts to lose that. And when I'm saying that, I'm saying over a period of like 50 years, okay? It loses that. It's sanitized, and the idea of it being about a woman is replaced with the idea of being about Texas. So by the time it gets to Elvis Presley, the song is about a blue-eyed woman with blonde hair, probably. It is about Texas. It has all kinds of references to Texas. It references Amarillo. It references Dallas. It like mentions Texas cities. And that's in the 60s, right? So Elvis sings this song. Oh, and then he also combines the eyes of Texas. So he creates this, what I call one of the first line dances in Viva Las Vegas. Because when he starts the song, it starts to have that cadence that becomes popular in the 50s, which makes it the marching song. And everybody starts dancing behind him, and he's dancing with Anne Margaret. And before you know it, he's singing about the Yellow Rose of Texas as a blue-eyed girl who he pines away for in Texas, and then it moves into The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You. So he's singing this, for almost the rest of his life, he's singing this song. So this goes into probably, when did he die? In the 70s or something like that? So by the time many, many people today are on the planet, I mean, we're born, we are able to hear the song, we start to associate the song in a different way than it had been in the past. So is the song racist? I could never answer that, because I knew too much about the song at this point, But if I just heard the song the way Elvis Presley sang it, I would have gone, I don't know. Well, probably not. I don't think so. But when you know the history of the song, suddenly it takes on a different meaning to you.
Right.
So, and it kind of starts making me question, what does the Yellow Rose of Texas mean to me? And it means something to me totally differently now than it probably meant when I was growing up. And I always wanted to make sure I had a yellow rose in my hair, as a little girl or something. Oh, what the Yellow Rose of Texas, it probably means something different to me now.
I think so many chapters of like charitable organizations will name themselves the Yellow Rose chapter.
Yes.
And when people are moving out of state or moving into the state, they're especially if they're female, there will be blue bonnets, our state flower, right. And then there will be yellow roses, and it's just like, oh well, those are Texas flowers.
Yeah, well, you can go, I don't know if I had this in the book or not, but you can go on to the DMV site and you can buy a yellow rose license plate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I think that, when you talk about what is the Yellow Rose today, to me, you don't even need the song, you don't need the legend, you just need to see it. And right. Which is what you're referring to, because there are Yellow Rose of Texas whiskeys, there are Yellow Rose of Texas lines of vehicles, and you pay extra money to get that on your truck, right. So it means something about Texas pride, I think. It's so embedded into our culture of being Texan that it almost ignores the experience of Emily West now. Does that make sense? Right? What happened to her, the song, I'm sorry, what happened to her, the way Sam Houston created this salacious tale about her, the way that she was turned into a caricature of herself when the song and the legend and the story came together. It's almost like that's not even part of what people see now when they see the emblem of the Yellow Rose.
Right.
And how that very good point. To me, it almost today it takes on sort of the same symbolization as like the Georgia peach or the English
Yeah.
rose, you know, like, you know, if you're, you know, if you're a feminine, sweet woman in Texas, you know, you're a yellow rose of Texas, which is completely far off from the origin story of this whole thing.
Right.
So
Right.
like, oh, she's an English rose, or, you know, she's a Georgia peach. So I definitely see that today as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think when Meghan Markle married Prince Harry, they started this narrative that Kate Middleton was an English rose as a way to distinguish her from Meghan, you know, which is a very different person completely in so many levels, right? So yeah, I can see what you're saying about that. I think now here's something interesting about when you're talking about what does that mean to be a Texas woman, right? Because that's kind of what you're saying. You know, if you're a Southern Belle Texas woman, then you're a yellow rose, right? So they started in the 50s, separate from the story. The story was not known, but the song was a huge hit in the 50s. And the governor back then began a commission called the Yellow Rose of Texas. And he began giving it to women who did outstanding things for the state of Texas's culture, like in literary work or charity work or something like that, right? And he could give it to him. And he still gives them to people. I mean, you know, in my presentation last year, they were giving out a commission to the Yellow Rose of Texas. And so you kind of have, they also are using the Yellow Rose of Texas as a way to promote women empowerment, women voting rights, things like that. So I think you're onto something with that. There is an idea of what the Texas woman is supposed to be, right? Maybe you have that in your head. And she was one thing during one point in our history, and then maybe now she's becoming something else, and maybe it's meaning something different. Maybe you're not recognizing the woman who is giving a lot of money to an art gallery, but maybe you're recognizing the woman who's standing up for voting rights, you know. So maybe that's changing too. I really don't have a strong feeling or an answer about that, but I definitely think about it a lot, because I'm giving more and more presentations again as we kind of start to, you know, figure out how to handle COVID. So I'm doing more presentations. So I'm still thinking through that. But I do think there is a place for Emily's story in our history books and in our mainstream culture today. And then I also think that there's a place for our song, the song, and how it became, how it moved, how it changed during the times. And then I also think the symbol of the yellow rose itself is something that we need to consider when we talk about becoming a modern Texan and being Texan in today's world.
Yeah. It also makes me think of the Jane Long, I believe, that is the mother of Texas. And
don't tell me that. Just don't do that. You will not believe this. You will not believe this. So see, here we go again. So yeah. we're gonna have to do another book. Because yesterday I literally wrote an email to some of my museum friends, and I said, hey guys, I know you've been talking to me about Jane Long. Maybe we can talk about her a little bit, because I began thinking she's probably another Texas woman who deserves a second look through a modern lens. Yeah. So anyway, go on with what you were going to say.
One thing I do see that the two, she and Emily West have in common is that they were survivors.
Yeah.
And they overcame some extreme obstacles, and then they were here in Texas at a time that it was hard for anybody to be in Texas at that time. But it was extremely hard for women because they didn't have the autonomy that we can enjoy now. Because they weren't voting, and they weren't able to get things such as own bank accounts and things like that. And I'm sure there were a million workarounds for that. And so on and so forth. But I was just struck by that thing between the two, because there probably isn't that much in common between Emily West and Jane Long, but Jane Long was able to survive on Bolivar.
Yeah. And her story is interesting on its own. But when you think about, because I have been thinking about this, I can't believe it. Every time I talk to you, Jory, it's like you and I are like,
you're making me blush.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. But what I started thinking about with them was that ultimately, okay, Jane Long was married, right? But then she becomes a widow, and these are two. And in Jane Long's life, there people questioned whether or not these things she was saying about all these big Texas figures, that they were all supposed to kind of be in love with her and they're all supposed to want to date her or marry her or something, because Jane Long ends up building a pretty substantial life for herself. I mean, she ends up, she doesn't always become this struggling woman out in Bolivar with lots of snakes running around, right? And shooting off cannons and stuff like that. I mean, she builds a life for herself. But I started thinking about that, and you have basically, I mean, Emily had to have been a strong woman. Whether we don't know, by the way, we don't know if she was biracial. We don't know. We don't know anything about what she looked like, which is one of the reasons the book does not have an artist rendition, because every other book about Emily had an artist rendition. And I thought that's not fair to her. So we're not going to have that. And so luckily my publishers were pretty cool about that. So that's why we have that on the cover. But she had to have been a strong person to get up on that boat and come down here as a single woman, right? And so in that way, the struggle for survival between the two women is very much, I think, a combination. I mean, there's something to be said for all of that. The idea that somewhere along the way, Sam Houston wants to create a sexual narrative for Emily, I think could have been, it's one of the areas I wanted to look at. Jane could have been a victim of that same sort of thing, but for the white woman. And I think that a lot of the stuff that Sam Houston was doing was to promote chattel slavery. This idea of a highly sexualized Black woman, right? Mm-hmm. I think there could have been another reason that you wanted to say that Jane was kind of crazy, thinking all these important guys were in love with her, right? Yeah. But you could also say, if Jane had created a pretty substantial life for herself, where she had money and she was making money, you could kind of see where struggling rebels might want to hook up with her. And she might say, oh, no, you're not taking my money, you know? Right? So I think when you look at these women's stories from a women's perspective that is not trying to maintain the male narrative, you end up with I think, a richer story, a story that might be worth telling more on its own merits than trying to fit it into a narrative. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons I never really liked Jane Long. I was never a big fan of hers. I thought she was a crusty old woman who just had a chip on her shoulder. And somebody came to me and said, well, did you know about this relationship she had with this little Black girl named Kian? And long story short, she ends up taking Kian with her whole life. And today there are descendants of Kian in Houston right now who still remember the story of Jane Long and Kian together. Now, so I kind of started thinking, well, that's kind of interesting. That's an interesting story, right? Why does this little girl come and live with Jane Long? And why does Jane Long basically raise her and stay close to her to the point that the ancestors, many, many years later, still remember Jane Long as the woman who brought Kian into their, that took care of Kian?
Yeah.
I don't know. And Kian wasn't a slave. She was almost like a daughter or a niece or something like that. So so I started having a different view of Jane Long and started kind of thinking maybe there is something to this idea of looking at strong Texas women's stories from a different perspective.
Yeah. And there's and it's definitely multifaceted how much is going on. I mean, so and they're people, they're going to have these flaws. They're going to also have these wonderful qualities that we would love to see again in other people.
Right.
Anyhow, there's a lot to consider when evaluating and these different people. And I think there's quite a mistake when you have different legends, because people can only theorize about what Cleopatra looked like.
Yeah.
And I remember reading this biography of Cleopatra several years ago, and it had and the cover of it had was the back of her head, and she was wearing a diadem, and and there was a description of her, but there weren't any pictures of her, and it leaves a lot of imagination and wonder to the reader, I believe.
Right. Yeah. So that's another one who we decide what she looks like,
Sure.
We decided, now the idea that Emily was beautiful comes from Sam Houston's story. He describes her as beautiful, and he describes her as a mulatto slave, I believe. I have the book in my, I have Bollart's book in another room, but he does mention, now the archivists did put a footnote from that story, and it's very short, and it doesn't even give Sam Houston the credit for doing it. That came later, but he calls her a beautiful mulatto slave, I believe, and that's when the name Emily Morgan becomes known. Before that, and since then, since the 50s, we have found the actual contract that she had with Morgan, and she signs it in her own hand as Emily D. West. So that's how we know that she was not a slave. The contract is very clear. It's literally one that any one of us could sign with a client today. And it's for 1 year. She makes $100, and then she's done with her contract.
Wow.
Yeah. So you're right. The idea of multifaceted, multi-level women's lives are very interesting, and I think underrepresented in some way when we talk about Texas history. But I think even our own heroes, I mean, Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin, Lamar, you name them, they are also very, we only know them on one level too. Fannin,
Sure.
We only know Fannin for Goliad. It's only been lately that we've been talking about him in terms of, being a major slaveholder, so, how do you come to terms with all of that?
This is the year for that.
I'm sorry.
I said, this is the year for that, huh?
Yeah. Well, right. So this is the way that I take it, because I know there are a lot of people who still want to believe this story about Emily, right? And I don't want to did any research on her in the past that what they did was wrong, because everything they did about her informed what I did today. And so I often think that if we took that approach to our other Texas heroes, maybe we could transform them into something much richer, much more true, much more holistic. And maybe we can start to see the whole story of how Texas was created and developed. And maybe that gives us a better understanding of what it means to be a Texan. I just kind of, I don't have a problem with looking at the flaws of our heroes, because I think it just gives us a better story of Texas. And I really feel like the story of the Texas battle from the Mexican perspective is completely underrepresented, which is one of the reasons some of the guys like my book, because I actually try to take pieces, handwritten pieces of the Mexican. There's not a lot. You can't get a lot, but there's some. You can get reports for what they thought was going on, and then here's what the Texans thought was going on, and I try to put them together, right? Because as a journalist, you try to get both sides, or you used to anyway. I'm sorry, right. Stress, but you used to do that. I was trained to do that. So I do that, and people are very surprised because they see an image of the battle that they don't normally see. And I wasn't even going for that. I was just trying to get to Emily. I was just trying to write all that down.
Right.
But a lot of people like that.
Yeah.
And the reason I did that is because in the 1900s, I got a hold of textbooks about the battle and about the revolution. And you would be very surprised at how critical those books are about the way the Texans did their deeds. They are much more critical of Texas, and they present Texas as there's this Mexican territory, settlers came in, they started a war.
Yeah,
do. It was very mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And so that told me there are a lot of historians out there also who had seen that. I mean, they'd seen that this is the way Texas used to be portrayed. This is what happened in the 50s, and this is what we think about Texas today. But when people were still pretty close to the revolution, they were pretty critical. They didn't just say that Austin is this great guy. There were people that literally didn't like Austin. They thought he was a manipulative little politician, and he was playing both sides of the fence. They kind of look, so it's very interesting to me. And I think it's important that we ultimately figure out a way as a state and as a country to embrace these various viewpoints so that we get a more holistic view of what was really happening. And we may find out that what was happening back then may or may not be very different from what's happening today. But it definitely informs us on a much larger scale of who we are.
Yeah. And I know that it's a big piece of, the Texas identity with the Texas Revolution, and colleagues and I just this summer we were joking about about how Texas could split into 5 different states if it wanted to. Yes. It was a very long story and it was very silly, so I won't go into it. But and there are just so many legends, just for our state, and there are other states and regions and countries that have really strong identity, connected to their lore. But yeah, I know that one of the things I had read about Santa Anna was that the Mexicans didn't like them either.
Oh, they didn't. They
that,
didn't.
that did not at all surprise me. There are like some shades of Napoleon there.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes. I
and
know that in the book. You're absolutely right, Jory. Yeah.
yeah, and he wasn't all horrendous, but I don't think I would enjoy being at a dinner party with him. You know, for sure.
He was raised and fashioned as European royalty. Yeah, he was. And he was trained in Napoleonic battlefield techniques. And
Right.
they are ruthless. They are ruthless. But here's something someone once told me about Santa Anna, and I think it's true. And I didn't realize it until after I'd written the book. Santa Anna was a better politician than he was a general. Sam Houston was a better general than he was a politician.
Yeah.
So Santa Anna, when the battle starts, his staff are like, the dude was sleeping in the tent. Other generals ran out when they saw, everyone running out of the field, which was totally not the way European battlefield tactics occurred. Okay, that was a guerrilla attack.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Texas did, a guerrilla attack. And Sam Houston is very clear about how all that happened. And other guys that were there, they wrote their reports about how they decided they weren't going to play fair. And they voted on that. So when they start running out into the field, there are Mexican generals who immediately went, this is not good. And they get on their horses, they start trying to rally the guys, but it happened so quickly that by the time Sam Houston came out, he was like, oh, what's going on? And he takes off, So that's one of the things I use in my book to discount the whole idea that there was a woman in there with him. Because they say he was just a bad general. He just kind of didn't know what to do. He didn't take charge. His other generals were down by that point because the Texans had taken them down. And Texas already had control of the artillery within like 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. But they stayed on that battlefield for much, much longer than that.
Yeah.
So Texans did not go in, take control, take over, and stop.
Mm-hmm. And I think, and I also remember getting the impression of Stephen F. Austin that he had rather poor health, and I know that he had spent some time in anyhow, I remember thinking that, and I know that he also spent some time in like in a Mexican jail. Yeah. And that like made it and he had a really hard time recovering from that. Yeah. I don't think he ever did. And I think what he was prepared to do, like as an impresario, it wasn't quite what life dealt him. Yeah. And so I've always imagined that he was a fairly, reserved person, but he was sharp enough to make decisions that he was probably a good businessman. I just don't think he was good at some of the other things. I mean, like being a general or anything like that. And but these are definitely the things that we all grew up on, and like almost every Texas town has an Austin Street or a Houston Street,
or a great big statue of him.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about Austin. In the other book that we were talking about earlier that I wrote about the boy that became the man that was raised basically by Morgan, his uncles were the ones who did the Fredonian Rebellion out in East Texas. And that's a whole nother crazy story. Gosh, that's a crazy story. Anyway, those guys were hotheads. And one of them was in particular. And Austin would write to them that they need to, and you're right, he was a very good businessman. He said, you cannot be going off and, you know, popping off at the Mexican government. You can't be trying to take over towns and, you know, get rid of all the people that had been there. In fact, part of them was Jane Long's family. You can't go off and get rid of them just because they live there. Yeah, that might be your property, but you can't get rid of those squatters and expect to survive this thing. So he was very good about saying, you've got to look at this from a business perspective, even though it makes you angry. So you're right about that. He had a cool head like that. And ultimately, the Hayden brothers did not listen to Austin, and they were getting ready to, you know, basically create their own country.
Yeah.
So the Mexican government is storming them. They're getting ready to come in. And part of what the Mexican government did at that time was create a big force. So if you have like a little bitty group of people that are upset with you, you bring like 1,000 people with you, you know, just to intimidate them. And that's what they were doing. And Austin wrote to the Mexican government and said, please be careful. Please don't hurt them. They are my friends. And that is why the Hayden brothers weren't executed right there when the Mexican government got up there. So you're right about that. The idea that he could see both sides. He could plead cases when he needed to. He was a good businessman. You're right about that. I do believe that when you're talking about the Mexican jail experience, that changed everything for him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That changed everything. He came out of that very anti-Mexican. Before that, he was still willing to negotiate. It was a traumatic experience for him. And I agree with you. He probably got sick and never got better after that. Right. And it changed his entire perspective. He came out a rebel. He became a rebel. Now, Morgan, this is another thing that just adds a layer to why would Emily want to work for him. Morgan was always a rebel. He was a rebel from the minute his boat came around into the Brazos River. He was a rebel because he was mad that Mexico said they weren't going to tax the immigrants, which is really strange for me to say, right? Mexico was going to tax the immigrants. And what are we talking about today? America taxing the Mexican immigrant. But he's really mad about that because they changed their mind and they started taxing. And so he immediately considered that like a reason to just, you know, try to have the revolution and everything. So he came on the scene as a rebel. So he had to have known that Texas had plans to be a slave state. I don't know that he had knowledge that they would try to take the rights of the free blacks and turn them into slaves. But he definitely knew that it was going to be a slave state. So that just adds a layer to why would an abolitionist sign a contract for Emily to leave with a Texas rebel who believed in Texas becoming a slave state? Why did all that happen? Why? Was it because it was such a dangerous place with the riots and everything? I don't know. You know, we just have to kind of, those are questions that we don't know, and we may never know. But I think it just adds to the complexity of her story and just makes it that much more powerful.
Definitely. I think that there's just a whole lot of color to it. No pun intended. But like you've got like different you've got these different aspects to it. It's not just you know, one end of the spectrum to the other. You've got everything in between, all these shades of gray.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, but that's just another angle. But to your point about Austin, I do agree with your assessment of him.
Yeah. Also, I think he probably would have made a really excellent attorney. Like he could have held his own in a courtroom. but I think he also had but he was a negotiator. I would consider that too. But and then and anyhow, but some of the things that some of these heroes and heroines did. I mean, there are some things perhaps make me squeamish when I consider them or look at them, and I'm just like, ooh, I don't really want to think about that. But yeah.
Oh, yeah, they were cool and products of their times, and it's easy to romanticize who they are and what they did,
definitely
years and years later. But
right.
When everything was happening, they had good sides, they had bad sides, or flaws. And I want to talk about going back to what you were saying, Lora-Marie, about how some women's story gets told, especially when their identity is very much, or their story is very much tied to their relationship with a man. It really made me think of Sally Hemings' story and how, so much has been written about who she was and her participation in the situation. And it really makes me think, like, who was she? And the whole, we don't know what people look like, when they didn't have selfies back then. But, I've seen so many visualizations of her, or, images of people's visualizations of her. And so she's another woman who her identity has really been constructed by the stories of men writing about a man with whom she is so closely identified. So it really made me think of her story.
Yeah. And you could also do that to Susanna Dickinson. You could also, there's so many women that you could do that to. And I think that even today, if you wanted to even think about that, you could almost take Marilyn Monroe's, the legend of Marilyn Monroe. You could take any of the early Ma Ferguson. I mean, there's so many. I just think that there's, like you were saying, this is the time to really think about, can we start crafting new narratives and start looking at things that we thought were settled and kind of look at them from a new lens, because history changes. This idea, I do not subscribe to the idea that once a story is written, that's history. I guess that's because, having been a journalist, I know how quickly a story can change. So what I write on Monday may be very different from what I write on Friday. So it's all, life changes and life moves. And history, you may have a story that is an example of an experience or a moment as part of the story, but taken as a whole, we can look at history again and see it change. We can do that. I do not subscribe to the idea that there's only one version of history. There's not just one version. And we certainly have only been telling one version. That became very, very clear to me when I was doing Emily's story.
I agree. I'm currently reading a really good book. It's called The Landscape of History.
Oh.
Have you heard of it? It's a good one by, I think, hold on. Actually have it. So this is what it looks like.
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
The Landscape of History by John Lewis Gaddis, how historians map the past. And it's a really interesting book because it talks about, what is historical consciousness, and it really makes you reconsider what exactly, as the reader of history, what are you expecting to find when you open a history book. And because you have to keep in mind, the person who wrote that historiography, they weren't there, first of all.
Right.
And they're only going to know so much based on other historiographies. And so I recommend this book.
Oh, good.
Because, like you just said, you can't take a history or historiography and just say, okay, this is the definitive on this story, because there's so much that goes into crafting a story about an experience that you did not have yourself, So knowing that, you do have to be open to the fact that these written stories can and need to be revisited, for deeper explored. So yeah, interesting stuff. Interesting.
Yeah. I think when I started this, Jory can tell you, Black Lives Matter and Me Too and all of that wasn't even on the table back then. I mean, we were like, in just that short period of time, it's like we're in a whole new world. But I felt like, after speaking with her and then talking with my other friends, I really felt like I just felt strongly that we just, to have another lens or to have another voice on a Texas legend like that was not a bad thing. And and maybe I was going to come into some viewpoints that really didn't like what I had to say, but I was like, I'm not scared of that. Maybe that's because of my training as a reporter. Every single day you're putting out stuff that people read and judge and tell you what, I was kind of living with that feedback that you get on social media all the time as a journalist. So I was kind of hardened to that a little bit. So I wasn't afraid to do it. But I'm very proud of it. I'm proud of the book. I'm proud of the conversations that it causes people to have. I think I've had more interesting conversations about this book than any of the others that I've written.
It helps people expand their viewpoints.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Yeah. When I first saw your presentation at the library, when was that, Jory? It seems like
I know, we were just talking about that. Yes.
Seems like ages ago. Oh my goodness, the world was so different, literally. But you blew my mind. You blew my mind, because I just had never, I'd never explored this subject on my own. So all I knew about it was, the lore, the myth of the Yellow Rose of Texas, and the song, and the story about, this supposed tryst, that's so the work that you do is very important,
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And explore these things, and especially things that are so close to our identity as Texans. Texans are very particular about Texas identities. So I applaud you for doing that.
Thanks. But this is one of the things I figured out once I got done. And if you grew up in Houston, right? Jory, I don't know where you grew up. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Houston.
Okay, and I don't know where Jeanette grew up, but I grew up in Fort Worth,
Ohio.
So
I grew up in Northeastern Ohio.
Oh, okay. So 3 of the 4 of us here grew up in Texas, right? And so we all went through Texas history, which is the foreign concept to people who do not live in the state. But we went through Texas history. And I thought, after I started learning all this stuff about the connection between New York and Texas, and the connection between, and actually how much New York actually had to do with funding the rebels in Texas, I started thinking, what if I had learned about Emily's story in that context? You know, if somebody presented to me, this is a woman who lived in this relationship, how would that have changed my view of Texas? You know, because I think we learned about the connection between Texas and Great Britain. You know, that Great Britain wanted Texas to be a cash crop nation for them. You know, give them cotton, give them sugar, so that they can live better. You know, live a royal life up there.
Yeah.
This connection between New York and Texas, to me, I thought that is very, very interesting, especially today, when you consider the fact that Morgan's New Washington Association became the Port of Houston. It is built on the Port of Houston. And we are also in Houston today, we are surpassing the New York port. And here's another one to lay on top of that. The New York Port Customs Collector was the one who created the New Washington Association as a way to transport New York goods and people between Texas and New York.
Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting.
I mean, how would that have changed our perspective? You know, I don't know, but that could be a way maybe to introduce, and I'm just thinking this as I'm speaking this, that could be a new way to introduce Emily into Texas history in a more real, way, in a more context that was probably true to her life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to interject it. We're at 30 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You've been doing good on time. You've been able to fill it very well.
It's because I talk a lot. I talk a lot.
Because it's interesting, Jeanette.
Well, what you were just saying, Lora-Marie, it is interesting because, you know, when you think about Texas history and historical identity, you think about, you know, strong Texans who did it on their own, you know.
Yeah.
You're not really thinking about the New York connection, and you're thinking of, you know, settlers in a wagon trail.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Or coming over on a boat or something. But you know, Austin even left Texas to go get people from other parts of the United States to come down and be part of the troops. So the troops were not all these, as I think we kind of think of them as these settlers who all got together. I mean, these were literally guys from America that came in to be part of the troops. And Houston, and this is, I think, where some people say he's a better general. He was very, very concerned that the troops got paid, or not paid, but the troops were treated well. You know, for example, when they stopped at, and this was also the Mexican group too, when they were sitting at San Jack and they were creating their camp. So they were both sitting on each end. They went out and both sides killed this is crazy. They killed 100 cattle and they ate it for dinner and they were very, very full. And so I'm like, whoa, because we did, and that's another aspect we don't even think about, is how much wildlife and how much roaming cattle and how much different the life was then. But the point to that is that Austin and Houston, I think, were very concerned that this misfit MAGA ruffins that came over thinking they're going to take on this, you know, massive army, they still needed to be treated well. And to me, I had never really thought of that, because I kind of, like you, I kind of thought, oh, well, I guess these were all kind of like settlers who just kind of like got together and, you know, decided to do this, you know. But it was a national effort. It was a national effort. That's the best way to describe it. Yeah.
Also, there's pardon me, that we were talking about like Texas pride earlier. It's rather elite to be able to get in the, you know, Daughters of the Republic of Texas.
Yes,
and they're very they're very careful about who gets to go in and into places and into their library and things like that. And there's a whole lot of pride to be able to join such. And I remember when I was a kid meeting people who said, oh, well, I'm a 5th generation Texan. And I'm just, anyhow, I'm barely like I'm almost a 3rd generation Texan. I have some relatives, ancestors that are from out of state. One of my grandfathers was from Mississippi. So, but anyhow, but how much pride people take in that. And I've seen that in some other states, like when I think 10 years ago, I got to go to Hawaii, and I really saw a lot of pride in, being Hawaiian, being living there, having those deep roots. And Texas definitely has that too. But and then when I go to some places, they couldn't even identify the flag. And I'm like, that's weird. And then you see the flag. Like, okay, I understand. Yeah. No offense to other states, but
we know the Texas flag when we see it. Well, some people, I think, to some people who moved down to Texas, and friends of mine that I know that have moved down, like recently in the last few years, they don't know why we pledge our flag, why we say Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And so you have to explain it to them. Texas used to be its own nation, and, right. And then they're just kind of like, what? And so it is very, it can be a big culture shock, I think, for people to come into Texas today and see that kind of pride, because it's different from Hawaiian pride. Hawaiian pride is more, it's just kind of there. It's like an ambiance, it's a welcoming little feeling you get. But in Texas, we're in your face. Right. We are in your face, right?
I want to ask Jeanette, speaking of Texas pride, because Jeanette, she is from Ohio, and so I want to ask her. Well, Jeanette has long been in Texas, for a very long time. But before you moved to Texas, I want to know, like, what were your preconceptions? What did you think you would find? And just, growing up.
Were you disappointed that you didn't ride horses to work and school?
What were you expecting, heading when you were gone to Texas?
I really wasn't sure, because I knew, Texas is a big place. You had the cities, you had West Texas, you had the piney woods, because I did my research, but until you get to a place, you really can't experience it.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say that Texan here is different than the Texan in El Paso, is different from the Texan in Austin.
Oh,
and
yeah.
A lot of people don't, which is different from the Texan in Fort Worth and Dallas, which is still different from the one in Amarillo. So
it's like a whole nother country.
Yeah, I know. I've recently been speaking to a friend of mine from New Jersey who literally didn't understand that. And we actually have 5 different geographical regions. She said Texas is so hot, and I said, well, that depends upon where you go. Because I grew up and we had snow in Fort Worth. We had snow. We had blizzards. I drove through. I learned to drive in ice in Texas.
And if you're up in the Panhandle.
Yeah, you have blizzards. And she was like, what? Blizzards? Because they assumed that all of Texas is like Houston. Like, no, not everybody has as much humidity. You can actually be very dry. Head on over to El Paso and tell me how much humidity you have over there,
I have to explain to people whenever I'm on any social media and such like that, I'm from Gulf Coast, Texas.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And that is different than saying you're from the Panhandle. Very, very different. Yeah.
Very different. And when I was in a previous job, my boss was from upstate New York, which is different from New York City.
I thought
and whenever something would happen in the vast state of Texas, her relatives in New York would contact her and ask her if she was okay, and she'd say, "Oh, that was in Dallas." And so yeah, it was always something.
Yeah.
And yeah, and it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I grew up in Ohio. I go back in Ohio, and Ohio is so much smaller now.
Oh, Ohio's smaller.
It's so much smaller. You know, going to Cleveland from where I grew up is nothing.
Yeah. You thought it was big back then, but now you're like, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's Houston ISD is bigger than many small states on the Northeast coast. Just ISD, you know.
Right.
So, yeah.
I like it when they compare Harris County to other places.
Oh, right. Yeah. I've seen those too. Right. Yeah. So I think all of that just kind of adds a certain another level to what does it mean to be a Texan today, because we're much more of a global economy, you know, and as you know, because we do live down here on the Southeast Texas coast, we know how much of a global influence Texas has. But does that translate to someone who grows up in a small town in the Metroplex or in the Panhandle, in an area where I grew up? We did not identify with Houston at all. I mean, I was identifying with Kansas or Oklahoma. Oklahoma's a big one. Oklahoma, or, you know, even Wyoming, and this American cowboy, American pioneer type.
And then you come to Houston, this huge international city.
Mm-hmm.
Extremely diverse. And when I've traveled other places, I'm always just struck by the lack of diversity there. You know, I feel like growing up in Houston, like Jory and I, we've been very lucky to, I mean, my second elementary school, because we lived in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, was mostly Black. But for the most part, other schools I've been to, they were just always so diverse. So, I mean, I've always been exposed to people of, you know, different races, different religions, different backgrounds, friends whose parents immigrated over, you know, from somewhere else. So I'm so used to that. I'm so used to the diversity, and I have to remind myself that Houston is in a very unique position in that respect. It's not across Texas. So,
Right. Well, I remember when I went to college, I went to Baylor, and it is the world's largest Baptist university. And we have people from
Waco
that are there. I'm sorry, what did you say, Lora-Marie?
Waco. It's in Waco.
It's in Waco. Yes, it is. It didn't start out in Waco, but it ended up in Waco.
Oh, I know. My boyfriend, Bobby went to law school in Baylor, so I know. Yes, and my parents always thought I was supposed to go to Baylor. So yeah.
I think I know what you're saying there. But anyhow, and so we would have people from all over the world who were at Baylor, and in that way it was cosmopolitan. but then there were all the students that were from small Texas towns that, I mean, you had to really squint at the map to see them. And so anyhow, and it was really, really funny. And like people would see me at campus and they would ask me, are you part this? Are you part that? And they were usually the people from the small towns. And I'm like,
Wow.
not that I know. And, you know, but they were always asking me, they were always saying, oh, you're not all white. And I was just like, really?
Oh,
Tell me that.
Really? Yeah, and anyway, and then I, you know, but after graduation and like I'm working in the public, they're like, hey, that white lady over there. And I'm like, yeah, that's me. You know, but anyhow, yeah, and it I had one of a kind professors, but one of the things that was really eye-opening at Baylor were, you know, were my peers, because they were coming from really different backgrounds. Like there was a classmate of mine who was probably the only one in her community that went to college, and her dad was a doctor, and she scheduled, you know, and the way she did her schedule is not the way I would have done mine. I'm just gonna leave it at that. But just imagining somebody going around and being like that was just baffling to me.
Oh.
And whereas I also had classmates that were like the first generation going to college, and you know, brilliant people that have gone on to do some really awesome things. And it is a really interesting experience. And then coming back to Houston, in some ways, Houston's feels like a small town, but in other ways, it's ginormous.
Yeah, that is one of the things I learned about Houston.
14-minute warning.
Thank you.
You know, growing up in Fort Worth, that is small. That is a pretty small town, and it's still small. Although I thought it was huge back when I was growing up. But when I came
to a small city.
Yeah, and but when I came to Houston, that idea that there's 2.5 million people in Houston, but it does have a small feeling, you know. I mean, it's a very unusual that way, that, you know, we have these different wards and things, but we all still, I think Houston, what got me about Houston was you're either inside the loop or you're outside the loop. That idea. But almost everybody is inside the loop, even if they're outside the loop.
You're still part of the greater Houston area. I like that I can drive by cows on the way into work.
You can what?
I can drive by cows on the way into work.
I drive by cows on my way to work too.
Yeah, I can walk outside and see deer, you know, in Clear Lake, you know. Yeah. Space deer. That's what we call the ones from NASA. Oh, yeah, space deer got out. Space deer got out. Back in.
I have a question for you, Lora-Marie. So you know, being a historian and an investigator, have you ever come across other, I guess, myths or just strong stories, whether they be from Texas or not, that you have, you know, looked into a little bit more on your own, and you think people would be shocked to know what we don't know about it, since that's kind of, you know, your MO, you like to dig into things. What are some other big stories that, you know, you feel really aren't that much in the popular consciousness in terms of the whole truth?
I don't know of one that's captured my attention the way that the Yellow Rose has. I think when you talk about just things that might not be completely true, I'm interested in the idea of, well, DC intrigues me to some extent. I really am intrigued by the connection between DC and Texas and how those interplay in the background. Because Texas politics was very, had like a strong hierarchy for a long time. And it was, if you were in certain clubs, then you were groomed for certain things. So I'm learning more about that just because since I was doing correspondent work for DC news outlets for a while, I really started to notice that more. I started trying to notice how does Texas end up in DC? Because for a while, Texas did control DC. I mean, we had presidents, we had the Bushes, John Connolly, we did have very, Ted Cruz, we have these big figures that really play on the national and worldwide scene. And so that kind of intrigued me a lot. I think that, and I've had people who have asked me to do books about current Texas politics. And I don't know that I'm the right person to be doing it, but I think that I can bring a perspective maybe to it that other people can't, just because it's a woman's perspective. And most Texas politics books are written by men. But anyway, regardless of my credentials, I think that what's going on behind Texas scenes and how does that create a connection between DC and Texas, that interests me. And I had a blog for a long time. When I was getting my master's, I did have a blog called Texas Domain, and it was all about that. It was all about just trying to trace that connection. So I don't know if here's the deal. I think that hierarchy and those special clubs are still there. I just don't know for how much longer they're going to be there. Because
we're at 9 minutes.
Yeah, because Texas is growing so fast. And these little towns that you were talking about that were little bitty dots back when you were going to school at Baylor, right? Those are now dots, right? Like Waco was a dot, and now Waco is huge because of the TV personalities.
The Chip and Joanna.
Yeah, Chip and Joanna, because of Chip and Joanna, it's much bigger now too, right? But we grew up knowing Baylor as a college town, right?
Right.
So Texas is changing. So I don't know how much longer that hierarchy is going to be around. And that intrigues me. So I think that's a roundabout way of answering your question, which the short answer is really no other myth or legend gets my attention like the Yellow Rose. But there are other things. There are other things about Texas. There's other things about Texas that still intrigue me.
Mm-hmm. So, you have any idea of your next project?
I don't know. Like I told you, I did email 2 friends yesterday and talked with one about talking to them about Jane Long. Because out in Fort Bend, there is a collection of Jane Long stuff, because that's where her plantation was, and business was. And that's where Kian and her family are from, her ancestors are from. So that's still there. They have a lot of stuff about her there. And they also have a lot of stuff about Kian, I think. And I'm almost more interested in Kian than I am Jane Long, but I am interested in that connection between this lifelong relationship between a Black and a white woman at a time when, because Kian does eventually grow up to be a woman, right? She doesn't stay a kid forever. So you have this connection between a white woman and a Black woman at a time that's highly unusual. And how did that happen? And what can we learn from that? But beyond that, I keep playing with this idea of doing a serious nonfiction book about how to become active in democracy as opposed to politics. We spend a lot of time being active in politics, and we do not get active in democracy. So I keep playing with that. And I don't know which one I'll do. I think Jane Long I could do faster than I could do the other one, but I think the other one, that could be a pretty cool one too. Yeah.
That sounds awesome.
They both sound interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a hard one to get your head around. Yeah, that's the book. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Want to let the folks at home know you can request this book through the Harris County Public Library. So, yes, and Lora-Marie also has a website. Do you want to shout out your website, Lora-Marie?
Yeah, it's just my name, LoraMarieBernard.net, and I do have autographed books on that site.
And are you on any social media?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. I'm on all of them. Yeah, I was on TikTok, but I got off TikTok, but I think I might go back. TikTok's a hard one for me, you know, because unless I'm doing videos and dancing and I don't really, you know, it's kind of a hard one for me to get my head around right now. But I did Snapchat for a long, long time, but when they had their update, it really made me mad. So I'm not on Snapchat as much, but I'm still over there. I posted yesterday. Yeah, I'm on all the social media. It's all by my name. So if you just type in Lora-Marie, you'll get it.
Cool.
Everyone at home, make sure you check that out. And also, do you have other books other than this one that you've already published?
Oh, yes, actually. There is one that was really popular. It is about Monroe Edwards, who was basically a Texas slave smuggler who swindled his partner out of a plantation down by Angleton and Manville. It's called Chenango, and Chenango is still there. Not as a plantation, it's a McMansion little estate neighborhood now. But he swindled his partner out of Chenango, and he was basically found guilty of that. So he jumped bail and started an international crime spree. So I've done that presentation at the library, and I think that book is in the library too. It's called Counterfeit Prints. That book has a lot of white collar crime in it. He was basically a white collar criminal, and that surprisingly did very, very well. I do have another book, which I don't think is in the library, but I was commissioned to do the history of the Houston Center, which is where Discovery Green, George R. Brown, the Blue, you know, the House of Blues, that whole area. And I was commissioned to do a book on that, and it goes into the history of how Houston actually became moved from the plantation economy into the oil economy. So it focuses a lot on George R. Brown and on early 1970s history. And then my first book is actually the book that started it all. It's called The Lower Brazos River Canals. It's part of the Arcadia Image of America series. So if anybody knows that, that is a series of books that are very, very collectible. A lot of people like to collect them. So I did that book. That was my first book, and it was called The Lower Brazos River Canals, and it focuses on taking the water from the Brazos and moving it into the communities in Southeast Texas. So it basically follows the line of the Gulf Coast Water Authority. And so I traced the history of Texas from Austin all the way up to the time that the Corps came down and split the mouth of the Brazos into two. So
Thank you so much, Lora-Marie. But we do need to wrap it up because some of us have lunch.
Yes. Yes, I have lunch too.
Yes.
Lora-Marie, could you go ahead and share the full title of your work on Emily D. West, as well as the one on Monroe Edwards?
Yeah, so Emily is the Yellow Rose of Texas, the song, the legend, and Emily D. West. Right? Did I get that right? I got it right, right? And then the counterfeit prints, the slave smuggling, Monroe Edwards. Yeah.
And
And
we
I'm
have both of those in our system.
Yes,
Yes,
I'm proud to say that.
Yes. So, okay.
And those are available for checkout from Harris County Public Library. And so definitely look those up and place your holds today. And I want to thank everybody for being here today. Lori had to leave a little earlier, but anyhow, but thank you so much for joining us, Lora-Marie, and we look forward to sharing the presentation that she did for us back in February very soon, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.